Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Maven Capital Partners podcast Invested. My name is Laura Boyd, and I'm an entertainment reporter and presenter who's interviewed everyone from Harrison Ford to Lulu to Lewis Capaldi to Rod Stewart and many, many more in between. But this podcast is a bit different because here I'm talking to CEOs, entrepreneurs and business owners at the heart of some of the UK's fastest growing businesses. It is a fascinating insight into not only their companies that they've developed and started, but also the people behind these businesses, what makes them tick, the highs and lows of their careers, and their advice for anyone looking to follow in their footsteps. Today is one of my favourite episodes, if I'm allowed to say that. It's where I've chatted to CEO and co-founder of the business Kelpi, Neil Morris. Now, the Kelpi business do sustainable and recyclable and compostable packaging made from seaweed. But that is just one element of Neil's life. He has had a fascinating career path, from starting off doing band merchandise to moving into the BBC and corresponding, directing, producing from some of the world's biggest events, from major war zones to moving into working in tech in the BBC. It really has been quite the journey to get to where he is today. It's a really, really lovely and inspiring listen, and I'm sure you will learn something from it as I did. There's loads to take away from it, so I hope you enjoy this one. Hi, Neil. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. First of all, I love your room. That looks like a very creative room that you're in.
I take the chance occasionally to be able to work from home. Although we're mostly an office-based company where we can all work together, occasionally it's useful to be able to step outside. So this is the study at home.
Very good. And I see lots of medals and guitars in the background and everything. So we'll ask you all about these hobbies as well. But on the Invested podcast, we love to know about the people behind the companies. And you've got a very successful company in Kelpi. But I want you to take me back to the very start. What were you like growing up? What was Neil like as a little boy?
I guess the most interesting answer to that, probably fast forwards to leaving home, going to university and changing, rather than the probably quite ordinary story of childhood. But for me, I guess the entrepreneurial instinct started through university, where I got heavily involved in all the activities that I could do. And then having travelled quite extensively from mid-teenage years and in Western Europe, and then in a gap year and before university, and spending a year at Berlin University as part of my UK degree, and Berlin becoming my favourite city in Europe at a time of tremendous change. This was a city that was still divided by a wall, an island of Western Germany inside a relatively hostile East German state. And so a fascinating place to both spend much of my gap year and also a year at university. And that helped then really start to create both a desire in me to focus my business career on changing things for the better, but then also, as I moved to the US after I'd finished my first degree and set up my first business there, really start to develop my entrepreneurial instincts.
And that first business, was that the one that was band merchandise?
Yes, that's right. I was always a huge music fan, remain so today. And so I'd gone over to the US with no particular plans in mind, but was able to, through building a network there, develop a business selling merchandise for bands. This was the second British invasion, where the first British invasion was the Beatles, of course, and the second was the Smiths, Echo and the Bunnymen, David Bowie. There were loads of U2 fans, and so we were able to capitalise on that enthusiasm for British and Irish music by setting up a music merchandise business all around the US.
And was that great fun to do as a fan of music, to then take it to the next level and be involved as a business? What was that like?
Absolutely. And I think you're right. Inevitably, at the age of 22, when I set the business up, there was a certain desire to have a lot of fun as well. But fantastic to be able to do something that brought smiles to people's faces, very enjoyable, but also taught me a huge amount about business. It was a time of great opportunity in the US, the mid 80s. And I found a country that was able to welcome anybody from any walk of life to just get on with it and prove themselves through what they achieved, which I found to be a welcome breath of fresh air from something that was more constrained in Britain at the time.
And so you have that business. Was that successful?
It
Uh,
was on the parameters of what it set out to be. Yes, very much so. Enjoyable, expanded very well. But then a time came when I wanted to do something that was going to have a more profound effect on the world. And so at that point, I and my co-founder decided to shutter the business. And he stayed working in the music industry in the US. I came back to Europe to start my training as a journalist.
Well, yeah, no, so I work in media, I'm a TV presenter. So this really interested me. So, because normally, we're talking to people who go from business to business to business, but you've had such a diverse career. So tell me about going into that side of things then.
Yes, certainly. Diverse is the polite way of putting it. Inconsistent, I think I might call it. Lack of ability to concentrate for more than a couple of years on anything, perhaps. But I'd come back to the UK to pursue my ideas of journalism, went through postgrad journalism training and started on newspapers when newspapers were, of course, still a powerful force in this country, and was able to join newspaper newsrooms with 50 and more journalists in them, where today I'm afraid they're a shadow of that. But newspaper journalism taught me a great deal about news and the process. And then from that, I moved into TV and worked at BBC for three different periods of my life, initially working as a producer director on factual programs. And that took me to Bosnia at the height of the Civil War. It took me to Rwanda immediately after the genocide, and so I was able to be at pivotal points in global history, covering it for the BBC, but from an angle that wasn't purely on the news events, but also looked more deeply into the implications, the social impacts of wars and genocide.
Yeah, I mean, like absolutely fascinating. I think you should write a book about this, your life and career. And then so from media and from BBC and very kind of interesting and powerful jobs there. What took you then back into to business? What took you into that kind of setup and startups again?
I'd in later stints, having gone from the BBC to GMTV and back to the BBC again, I ended up working on interactive at the very start of really the online boom. At the BBC, I was commissioning editor for interactive, helping program makers devise the interactive content that would sit alongside their programs. And that gave me the opportunity to really start working on tech. And then as the dot-com boom happened around 99, 2000, I seized the opportunity to move from the BBC into the private sector just as the dot-com boom peaked. And we went into a dot-com bust. And anybody who was around at those times knows that it was quite a surreal environment where I was met by one senior individual looking at me and saying, "Neil, you do know this internet thing isn't going to work, don't you?" And so he was wrong, but it was a not uncommon view at that time.
Yeah.
So out of that, I was then made redundant at the bottom of the dot-com bust, having laid off my entire team at my employer at that time. And so faced with a 3-month-old baby, a mortgage in London, faced the motivating challenge to look at how my internet experience and views on business could be brought together to devise something that again would focus on public goods. So that made the right environment for me to set up Digital Public with my co-founder Jonathan Peachy. The two of us grew that from a kitchen table startup to a business that eventually exited in 2008 to the Engine Group. And along the way, we built a business which focused on digital service design for large public sector organizations. So working for government departments, for the NHS and for others, helping health, education and criminal justice really step into the internet era and move from thinking of websites as perhaps brochureware, which is what the dominant logic was in 2002, into instead using online for public service delivery. So we helped NHS Direct, for example, which at the time was purely a telephony service, start to use the internet to support those people for whom online consultation would be a far more effective channel to communicate. We helped the Department for Education set up Teachers TV. We helped the criminal justice system move towards starting to use online filing for the first time. And so a business that came from really our early experience of the internet was at the point at which the large organizations in the country were really starting to understand the power of online and how it could be used to improve services.
I don't think that that's such a thing, when we speak to kind of younger people within my industry today, they just can't believe that, at that starting point of the internet, people just didn't think it was going to be a thing. I mean, I remember when we started an online team within our company, in a large television company, the man that was going to head it up came to us with a book that was, the yellow books that's like for dummies, and it was internet for dummies. And he's like, we're just going to have to do something on this. And it was so kind of blasé. And I think, for the current generation, they just can't imagine what that was like. But it really was. And it was quite difficult to convince people, wasn't it, that this was going to be revolutionary?
Absolutely. Whether for a large global media organization like the BBC, which recognized that there was change happening, but I think even there possibly initially underestimated the profound impact that moving online would have. Along the way, I was one of the founding program editors for BBC News channel, then called BBC News 24. And that was set up as an end-to-end digital channel, the world's first purely digital news channel of its kind. And we were exploring how to use technology in ways that are commonplace today, but that were seen as quite revolutionary at the time. Whether that was actually delivering content online, or whether that was using online as a means of news gathering, getting journalists to edit on the fly news pieces. And coming forward to today, I think whilst we talk a lot about the digital native generation of younger people who've grown up only knowing digital, and I'm delighted to work with people who have that perspective because it re-energizes me in the way I think. I think also at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't lose some of the craft that created some of the great media and content of previous decades.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's about getting that balance, isn't it? And I can very much relate to your point about journalism and the newsroom. I mean, things have changed so drastically in some ways in a great way, but you don't want to lose that kind of journalism skill that that there was, instead of I'm getting out and getting stories and not just sitting in front of computers. I guess that's part of the battle as well. Neil, you sound like such a driven person and somebody who sees problems and wants to solve them and kind of turn that into something that can help other people. Have you always been like that? Have you always had that drive?
That's a good question. I think you'd have to ask those around me to really know the full answer. I would say yes. I am firmly of the belief that business can and must be a power to change society. And I think harnessed correctly, I think it has got immense power when we can bring together innovation and ideas and use business to amplify them and make them relevant to everyday life. One of the formulae by which I run Kelpi is a formula that I've invented, which is that change is the product of science plus innovation to the power of entrepreneurship. And so let's unpack that. The way that we create change in society then is bringing the inputs, in this case from science, which is how Kelpi was born originally, out of scientific progress. But we need to challenge that with innovation that makes sure it's directed in the right way, that we're focusing that science in something that really matters. But it's to the power of entrepreneurship where this really then expands to have a global impact. Because I believe that entrepreneurship is the raw fuel by which we can then really power global change. And whilst I have huge respect and time for those people who look to change things through charities, through lobbying, through pressure groups, and they're all an important part of the ecosystem, I believe that if we use business to create services and products that are relevant to everyday people's lives, then we'll really be able to amplify that science and innovation and accelerate the change that we need to achieve.
And Kelpi does packaging. I mean, tell us about this. Give us a kind of high-end overview of Kelpi.
Sure. Let me start, Laura, if I may, from day one, or even day minus 100, if you like, where the idea came from. So I'm a cyclist. The medals that you refer to over there are mostly from running or cycling events. That's one of my things. And so in cycling around the lanes around Bath, where I live, I was increasingly appalled by the amount of plastic litter, some of which had been there for a couple of days, some of which had been there for 20 years, all lying in the ditches where it hadn't been collected and failing to biodegrade at all, because that is the problem of plastic litter. And so I looked then and started to research further and recognize that whilst we rightly focus on carbon as the single most important problem facing us in climate change, it is not the only problem. If we were to achieve net zero tomorrow, then we would still be facing an existential crisis because of toxicity in our environments, reducing biodiversity. And in this case, in particular, the toxicity from plastics. So there are 171 trillion microplastic fragments estimated to be in our world today. Those are tiny pieces of plastic, smaller than 5 millimeters in diameter. And where are those 171 trillion fragments? Well, I'm afraid they're in you and in me. They're across our planet, from the top of Everest to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. They're in our blood, in our lungs, in our drinking water, our beer, our honey. They're in maternal placenta. They're in human testicles and mother's breast milk. We're raising right now the first generation ever reared on microplastics. We're conducting this appalling, huge experiment into what happens to the human race when we inject it with microplastics day after day. And whilst some of the data is only emerging now, it was the underlying understanding of the scale of the challenge that then made me look at that plastic litter in the ditches and go, right, come on, what can we do? This is crazy. We're pulling oil from under the ground to make plastic that lasts for up to 1,000 years, that causes these microplastic pollution problems. And yet the use case for that packaging is often as little as a couple of hours or a few days. The plastic packaging that you or I are bringing home from the supermarkets, because it's almost impossible not to come home with a bag full of plastic packaging, has been massively over-engineered for its use case. We've ended up with something that lasts for hundreds of years just so that we can get some chopped fresh fruit from the supermarket fridge into our own and onto our plates.
It blows my mind. And it's, I think you can see slight changes, but when you put it like that, I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it? And most people won't even think of that. So that obviously stuck with you, and then you decided we need to do something about this. So you make packaging from seaweed, am I correct?
That's right. So the beginning of Kelpi was always designed to be, right, well, rather than become a pressure group pointing out the horrors of plastic pollution, let's use my business entrepreneurial background and that of my co-founder, Murray Kenneth, as well as the other third co-founder, Professor Chris Chuck, who is one of the world's leading seaweed experts, And so my network led me to Chris and allowed Murray and I to walk into his office on day one, if you like, put on Chris's desk a fish packet which had contained fish that I'd eaten previously, and say to him, look, the fish in this packet had a fridge life of about 8 days when I bought it. The packaging is going to last up to 1,000 years. We think you're the guy to help us figure out a better alternative. And Chris responded really well. And that was the beginning of a fantastic relationship. And from that came Chris's scientific focus on taking seaweed, extracting the carbohydrate that we need, and using it as the basis for an entirely renewably sourced and, importantly, entirely biodegradable, very thin coating for paper, card, and fiber, which themselves can then replace the fossil fuel plastic packaging that we're so used to. So it was really that combination of Chris's scientific leadership and the team he was able to build in science, together with my own business experience and that of Murray Kenneth, to be able to bring the business rationale and then eventually start to work with clients on the potential solutions.
It is fantastic. But your drive and passion are obviously behind that as well. And as we said, diverse career. How has it been going from being in, a high-powered job to taking the risk of setting up a business? How have you kind of dealt with that? And has it always played out successfully?
I really enjoyed when I did my TED talk in Bristol, which has just been published. I really enjoyed working with an inspirational fellow TEDx speaker called Ollie France. And Ollie's an explorer. He's a guy who climbs mountains and helps other people go on long distance treks. And in his TED talk, he talks about the people who take the biggest risks in life are those who don't have anything to look back on or to put on their gravestone. The people who take the biggest risks are those who actually fail to take any risks at all. I've always felt that we're on the planet to make an impact, and we each find our own way in which we can do that. But I want to make sure that my two children, who are both now at university, have a chance to grow up in a world which can still prosper, and it has not been destroyed by the greed and selfishness of our generation above all others. And therefore, I feel it is incumbent upon myself and our generation to make sure that we do apply the skills and experience that we've developed in order to address some of the huge challenges that we face now.
Yeah, no, completely. And for anyone who's listening to this or watching this, and we get a lot of kind of budding entrepreneurs, budding CEOs, people who want to start up their own business, but maybe don't know how to do it or are afraid to do it. What would be your kind of 3 pieces of advice for them going forward?
I think to begin with, that you've got to take the first step. You've got to go ahead and take the plunge, and to not be too worried about exactly what the focus is to begin with, because it will change. And all good businesses adapt. Some go through a pivot where they change their focus from one particular area to perhaps a neighboring area. Others adapt as they first come in contact with their customers or clients and recognize that what they thought was a great idea is perhaps adjacent to or not entirely aligned with what the client or customer is prepared to pay for. So to get started is probably more important than to get the idea right. Having said that, my second piece of advice would be to make sure that you can ruthlessly focus on the things that matter. There is a saying, a mantra written up in our office, in Kelpi's office in Bristol, which is 4 lines, each with 3 words. And they say, the main thing is to keep the main thing, the main thing. And it's a very well-worn mantra, but it's written up on the office wall to remind myself and everybody else that it is really our ability to focus that marks us out perhaps from large organizations who don't have the same ability to be able to focus their entire resources in one place. So we have an ongoing cull of meetings in our business because they get in the way of doing stuff. You can't eradicate them altogether, but you can
Yeah,
try and get
they really do,
chaos.
don't they? Meetings for meeting's sake. I always
Absolutely.
there's a lot of them. And what would be your final piece of advice?
I think it's about the team. It is about bringing together the right people, and each business has to decide for itself, like any other organization, what makes people the right people. But I think moving beyond the idea that we can hire from a CV, but understanding that there is a particular approach, a mindset, and an aptitude that helps small entrepreneurial innovative organizations move very, very quickly. Without that ability to move quickly, that focus that I talked about, the willingness to take the first step that I talked about, I think
Yeah.
we're nothing. So it is finding people who are prepared to work at that sort of speed without finding themselves overawed by the scale of the challenge. So yeah, those three things: take the first step, focus, keep the main thing, and then recruit a really good team, diverse in its thinking as well as its makeup, but also able to rally quickly and move forward where they seize opportunity and recognize that there's a chance to change the world here.
Amazing. I'm going to keep the main thing in my mind now. I really like that. That's really good. What are your hopes for the future, Neil, in terms of both the business and, I guess, as someone who is looking to make change within the planet and, everything that's going on? What are your main hopes?
Good question. I'm a techno optimist. I believe that we can achieve the change that we need to in the world. I'm not a climate fatalist who's doom scrolling his way through news, but rather the ability to get on the front foot, use technology and change things is paramount in the way that I see life, that Kelpi works, and that I think we will actually be able to achieve that change. So I do believe that adopting alternative materials like those that Kelpi and others in the field can make will allow us to remove fossil fuel plastic production, whilst other technologies can be used to address the fossil fuel fragments, the 171 trillion of them in our environment today. I think the future for Kelpi is about scaling fast. We're already working with huge multinational companies like L'Oreal, for example, who procured Kelpi from a field of 140 sustainable materials providers worldwide and selected Kelpi alone to work with. And that gives you an idea of the power of our solution. But by working with a client like L'Oreal or the global drinks brands under the Diageo company, with which we're also working, we can achieve the scale which allows us to be able to address this huge global problem. And for me, it is about scale. That's why I think the entrepreneurial startup has the ability to be able to change the world in that way. And then the future for Kelpi, alongside achieving that scale, will be to continue to innovate, to not merely use one particular material solution to address one part of the plastics area, but to innovate and continue to develop new materials to replace all sorts of plastic, still focused, still keeping the main thing, which is replacing fossil fuel plastic packaging with our own coated paper card alternatives, but still being able to reach the scale that we need to address the horrors of the plastic pollution that we're facing at the moment.
Well, Neil, you are a fascinating man doing wonderful things. I could talk to you for ages. I'm so interested in this path that you've taken in your career, but it sounds fantastic and long may it continue. You're doing brilliant work and you've certainly left me with a lot to think about today. So, so that is a very good thing. I'm sure our listeners will love it too. Thank you so much for joining us and I wish you every success going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Laura. It's been a pleasure talking to you today and look forward to doing so again soon.
Well, thanks again so much to Neil for doing that. Now, if you enjoyed that podcast, then don't forget to like and subscribe to Invested. And if you would like to learn more about people like Neil and the work that Maven do, then visit mavencp.com. I'll see you next time.